Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Dana. I'm Design Director with Skidmore, Owings & Merrill here in Los Angeles. We are thrilled to have you all here this evening. Hope you've had a chance to enjoy the exhibit and hope you will enjoy the conversation that's about to ensue. We have a great group. We have an artist, we have architects, we have educators, we have an engineer holding down the fort here to talk about what happens when all those different disciplines come together in creative ways: art, engineering, architecture. And I think is some evidence of what we see when they do come together, although at sometimes distinct, wonderful, really memorable things happen. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Marc in 30 seconds to talk just a little bit about the exhibit and give everybody some background on how that's come about and the ideas behind it. But before that, I do want to give a very heartfelt thanks to the MAK Foundation. Thanks. Yes, thank you. So to any supporters, any board members, affiliates, thank you. It's been really fantastic being here. And at the end of the day, we think a really appropriate place. Because I will admit, when Marc first approached us with the thought of doing this exhibit in this house, a little anxious, maybe more appropriately, a little scared to death. It's like, how do you do this? How do you represent the scale of what SOM does in a house like this? How do you portray, or how do you curate, develop an exhibit with a cohesive narrative in a place with spaces that overlap and intermingle and mix and are in and out like this? How do you build something like this on a historic property? So all that said, at the end of the day, we think it really was a great choice. So thank you, Marc, for your persistence and insistence. We think a really fitting background and in that the ideas that really drove the house, the container, Schindler and his thoughts about modern architecture and this house that displays it all so well. Really a great container for the work that's represented here, both bound by that spirit of innovation, the spirit of what can happen when disciplines come together in meaningful ways. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Marc, and then I'll come back and introduce our panel.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Thanks, everybody, for being here. So just a little bit about this journey. A few years ago, right around 3 years ago, Detail asked us to put together a piece for a publication, a book. It was fourth in the series about engineering. And we were flattered that we could actually talk about engineering through this concept that it's based on just ideas, right? And so we put together a series of chapters that led to this exhibition. And it started very modestly in Munich at a bookstore, in the back of a bookstore. In fact, and this is a real story, small space. Largely, it had to do with those models that you see in this room, the scale models of the tall buildings that have either been designed and built, or at least conceived of around the world. They're the tallest in the world, including the Burj Khalifa, which at the moment is the tallest in the world. And a couple of other thoughts just about the exhibit. Really it tries to look at the similarities between art and structure and innovations that come from integrated design. And what you see, I think, here is it's an exploration, it's an experimentation, and a partnership of artists and architects. And everything that you see here in this exhibit is structure. There's no cladding, there's no decoration, there's no cover. It's the honest piece of what makes it stand up. And it's standing up against gravity and seismic loads and wind loads. And it has a philosophy that structures are in motion, that everything is in motion. So a lot of the things that you see here are dynamic, whether they're dynamic in earthquakes or dynamic through motion, that we'll show you here at the end of the discussion. Its structures should move. There are really 5 pieces of this exhibit: research and the future, scale and form, efficiency and economy, hierarchy and order, and we think maybe most importantly what we call creation and collaboration, and that's the work that you see with the artists that are included here. Anyway, we think that this place, the Schindler House, is a laboratory. It was a laboratory that looked at scale, material, and I would argue is the birthplace of modernism for residential construction. And we think that the installation, we hopefully accomplishes this idea that scale can be at many in many ranges, including taking the tallest buildings in the world and putting them in a place like this, so that people can see the difference and appreciate it. So that's a bit about this, and we'd love to get to kind of the next step, and Brett is going to take over. Maybe Paul, are you going to introduce us in some way?
I'll do that. Thank you. Our panel and our moderator have resumes that are way too long and incredibly impressive, way too long to go into in depth. So take my word for it. And what I also love about them is they're currently doing great things. They're active right now, pushing their respective agendas. So we're even more thankful for them being here this evening. Our moderator, Brett Steele, who is Dean of the UCLA School of Art and Architecture. We asked, and thank goodness you said yes. We couldn't think of anybody better to moderate a talk like this about disciplines coming together to become something greater than the sum of the parts. Sharon Johnston, next to Marc Sarkisian, architect here in LA, doing wonderful things all over the world. Heather Roberge, chair, architecture, UCLA, and a practicing architect. So thank you for being here, Heather. Marc wouldn't sit where I asked him to earlier. He said he was the agreeable one. I don't know. Yeah, be careful what he says here. But really fascinating career, an interesting fellow. Talk to him. Artist, curator, educator, administrator, kind of all things arts. So thank you, Marc, very much for being here. And my design collaborator every day, José Palacios, also design director at Skidmore, Owings & Merrill. So with that, I'm turning the microphone over.
Do I use this one or?
You can, why don't we'll give you guys 2, and you can,
Great.
it should be on, Brett.
Yep, it is. Thank you, Paul, for that and for the introduction. Everybody welcome, and thank you so much for coming in on a lovely occasion in a wonderful house that, if I understand it right, opens in 1922, which is less than 15 years, just to remind everyone, from when Skidmore, Owings & Merrill launches in the 1930s. And so you see, in a way, a convergence of 2 different things. One, the idea of a kind of prototype structure, and architecture has progressed through the making of prototypes, and particularly Louis Skidmore's obsession with thinking about a different kind of office that would produce ideas and knowledge and not just practice architecture in new and interesting ways, something that Skidmore, Owings & Merrill have ever since proven was real genius in creating a different kind of architectural office. So this is a wonderful occasion, I think, to talk about some of the ideas that are brought to the fore in this terrific exhibition. My thoughts initially, and just to build on what Marc was introducing a moment ago, there are really 2 things on display here, we could say. One would be the idea of a sort of prototyping culture, again, in fields of design, including architecture, engineering, and I would argue many other creative fields, that you could say has an undercurrent that's run for as long as we might think of as a topic like modern architecture. And for me, modern architecture is founded and comes in the 19th century out of just simply the delirious experimentation with new materials, new ways of working. It's a instinct that is founded literally in the middle of the 19th century with things like the Crystal Palace project that brings steel and glass together for the first time in architecture, and is so strange as building materials that architects don't know what to do with it. So London hires a gardener like Paxton to figure out what to do with 22 acres of that material, and it really founds the beginning of what we would all think of today as a kind of modern architecture. In the 20th century, a young and inexperienced builder like Mies builds a prototype pavilion in 1929, which ironically, even though its brief was to stand for about 6 or 8 months, and then come down when the exhibition is over, becomes, you could argue, one of the most influential buildings of the 20th century, again with the arrival of new and interesting materials and audiences coming together in new and unexpected ways that really foregrounds the kind of thing one can see taking place with the sort of experiments that are on exhibition here today, in something that SOM is quite deeply invested in, and has been, I would argue, for many, many years. If that's the first topic, the second topic that's already been alluded to that I think could maybe become a basis for our panel members' discussion is this peculiar question of what interdisciplinarity or collaborative design, creative cultures might be today in the early, still relatively early parts of the 21st century. That is a topic of great interest to not just some of us who are educators, but all of you who are practitioners, to try and think about the way in which these distinct professional forms and activities like architecture or engineering or industrial design are being sort of thrown up in the air in relation to one another, again, through the arrival of all kinds of new materials. I would argue the arrival of new design platforms. And it's also on display in the exhibition, a kind of collapse of the 20th century distance between what we used to call design culture and making of things. We now live in a world in which the very same files that designers are producing late at night in their studio are being emailed to companies that are then producing. And literally the kind of communication between what we used to call the studio and that outer world of making is another force that arguably is really the broader cultural and professional context for the sort of things on display tonight. I'm going to stop there with my points, because my job is really to just move the microphone around here amongst our distinguished panel members. And I thought maybe a way to start the conversation would be to turn to each of you and see if there might be something in your own professional experience, educational experience, academic experience, that might want to touch on one of those topics around either collaboration or experimentation and prototype making in your own work.
You want to start?
Why don't we start with, since you've got a microphone.
Well, maybe I should have not grabbed the microphone, but maybe I want to reflect in the context of the exhibit here a little bit about what went on putting this thing together, because I think is important in that, the exhibit, at least for those that participated in putting it together, is not just about the ideas and being able to display those ideas and communicate those to the visitors and create a narrative for the exhibit. But it was a lot about collaboration that happened between those that participated. That was a bit more organic, admittedly, than one would think. We didn't quite all knew how we're going to get it all done, because we're not contractors, but we got to build a lot of these. Yes, some help from Taslimi contractors on the things that we're just not qualified to do, but a lot of the other stuff we built it with our own hands. In that sort of organic collaboration created a spirit. We were just chatting a few moments ago, a lot of energy and a lot of delight among those people that participated here, and it created sort of this idea of or wanting to collaborate more, just because we were doing these things kind of out of our own nest. So with that, maybe I should maybe one more quick thing in terms of our own practice. We're collaborators, and Paul mentioned that, but with engineers, architects, everyone in our office. But I think there's a place for architects as by definition of being collaborators. We sort of occupy that place that I call it the bridge between nature and reason. We're both we can be artful, but we also can be scientists, and we are sort of the link between that art and the science. And I truly believe that, in the sense that we're worried about what things are more so than what they look like. We do care about what things look like, but what they are is more important. For that.
Terrific. Marc, would you
Okay,
like to?
sure. I'd like to give some context for what I think is a fairly strong aspect to city building, and and architectural practice and city planning, which is Percent for Art programs, which exist throughout the United States. They've been ramping up since the early 80s. We have them here. The City of Los Angeles requires developers to spend 1% of project costs on an art project. The city itself must spend 1% of project costs if they build a library or a police station on art. And programs like this run throughout the United States at the city level, the county level, and the state level. These programs came about with a set of, I'd say, philosophical and idealistic tenets, with a prominent one being the encouragement of early collaboration in the building and design process of architects with artists. And this came about as a kind of empowerment project, I'd say, on the part of administrators to ensure and help artists find places of power within the administrative structures of city building. So all of this idealism sounds grand. It didn't really pan out. The complexity of architecture and the complexity of development, be it private or civic, it was such that artists were never invited in until the building was very well designed, and certainly after entitlements had been procured. So by the time artists were able to have a seat at the table, the project was very well defined. And architects, for the most part, would find areas that they thought were advantageous for an art intervention. So this was a very big distance from what had been, I think, a very idealistic proposal for how architects and artists might work. And I think what we're looking at here in this exhibition is some very fine examples of where artists were situated in specific areas of buildings and worked with the architects and the engineers to make their ideas viable. And in the case of the projects here, I think they all soar. This thing soars physically, but it also has kind of a conceptual elegance and power to it, the Joma Plensa. So that is kind of the way I want to introduce my perspective here, is that there was a higher ambition for art and architects to kind of cohabit projects, and perhaps it can happen in the future, but it's a very challenging ambition.
I thought I would talk a little bit about how structural principles have been shaped by new technologies and new tools, and the ways in which old methods for empirically learning about structure kind of commingle with these more advanced or at least newer tools. So I was struck in looking at the exhibit at seeing a kind of weighted model that studied the kind of uniform loading of an arch and the way the physics of the model actually behaved, in contrast to some of the 3D printed models or models that are less dynamic because of the techniques of their construction, where you can't receive empirical feedback from the models. And so to me, there's a kind of really nice contrast in the show, which sort of displays the broad range of tools that designers have at their disposal, from tools that aren't meant to do the job you're solving, like a physics engine in a something like Unity, a game engine, can be mixed with a physical model where you can understand the dynamics of material in space. And so this exhibit is kind of a cross-section of how you have to move between new and more traditional modes of representation to understand structural principles. And I think that's something that's even seen in this large prototype, where you can understand by moving the structure how the loads are being redistributed. So to me, as an educator, there's a sort of quite didactic quality to the exhibit, because we see that in our studios all the time.
Thanks. So I think maybe I come at this in a slightly different perspective. Our studio has been working with artists in different ways since the very beginning of our practice. So I think for me, thinking about the idea of collaboration is, I think architects, we always do that. We're working in big teams, and we're lucky to work with great engineers sometimes. And I think specifically for our practice, the working with artists has been kind of core to how we create frameworks around thinking about problems in architecture. So I think it's even stronger in academia, where there's a sort of push towards interdisciplinarity. For us, I think working with artists, working with really strong engineers, it's not for us about like changing clothes and in a way eroding boundaries, but it's about using expertise from people that orbit around what we do to help us think about our core disciplinary questions in a more deep way. And so I think, we're not engineers working with artists, but artists are embedded in all of our projects. And sometimes we're creating spaces for them. Sometimes they're simply working with us, critiquing our work experientially. And I think that, that more and more as architects, our work is immersed in a much more complex social fabric, especially doing cultural projects, which is largely what our office does. Creating a more sort of diverse set of questions, a kind of culture around our project, I think artists for us are essential to that kind of discourse that we create around our work. And I think it's fantastic to see like the work that you guys did with Janet. I think it did, to Marc's point, maybe it wasn't totally germane to the building design, but it somehow informs the kind of spatial experience of being in those courtyards. And I think that deep engagement is sort of what we look for, whether it's artists more as consultants or when we're working with them as part of our team. And I think one of the things that we feel artists do really well, maybe it also keys into the point, Brett, you made about prototyping and just working with material. I think artists have a very direct way often that they work with materials. They're not always burdened by all the complexities that we are with structure and code and all those things. And so for us, I think we've learned a lot from working with artists about material and just using, it's fantastic to see these models, to think about how material resistance, as you're developing a project, how do you use the materials that you're designing with and thinking about to help you go somewhere? I mean, there's a kind of smoothness to a lot of the process in the way that we work today with 3D modeling and all of this stuff. And I think that the sort of mock-up, the kind of testing, the R&D of these kinds of models is something that really resonates with how we think about making architecture.
Terrific. Marc, in a brief conversation we had as we were starting, I was struck by a point that you made about the office and its sort of realization as a part of this kind of an activity of shaping an exhibition that the office is a producer of ideas and not just the deliverer of projects. And that sort of 20th century history of both engineering and architecture being organized around the sort of serial delivery of one project after another, and a shift in knowledge economies and a world that suddenly, in quite literal capital terms, will value ideas more than physical things. That's a sort of interesting moment that many creative fields are going through. And I was just interested in the different ways in which you and your collaborators in the office think about this idea of curating and organizing the knowledge that's being produced in some of these experiments and some of these projects.
So one of the things that we think is really important is how does engineering go beyond what we think of as traditional architecture, and some of the principles that we've developed with this exhibition and before this exhibition we think are relevant to things like urban planning. So for instance, we've created a technique that looks at placement of material in a way that's most efficient, right? So throw away the traditional idea of structure, beam and column, if you will, and think of it as surfaces or volumes, and analyze it independent of any preconceived ideas of what you want it to be, the imposed idea of what we've done, and come up with the best placement of material in that structure, right? So we've taken that same principle and looked at things like density, right? So imagine that you have support. In my world, structural world, might be a large support condition for a structure. And there's a simple idea of, we don't know what it looks like, but a structure that might span between these support conditions. And what you find is a force flow, if you will, of material from place to place. So you can imagine that the straight line is not the most efficient way for movement or structure. And we're finding this. If you look in this exhibition, you'll find that force flow, our force flows are going in unexpected ways are actually the most efficient way to place material to support gravity systems or lateral systems. So I think that push about ideas, that cross-pollination is what I think is important for us to think about, you know, and it's fed by just, I'll say, pure interest and ideas, but also it triggers this this collaboration with universities, on the academic side, the research side. So,
terrific. And that topic, and to open it up to the panel members, what you touch on is also the kind of the question of what constitutes form finding today, or a creative process itself. I'd be curious about where form comes from in all of this. I mean, there's plenty of it here, and the presumption is it's coming through different kinds of cross-disciplinary, collaborative ways of thinking and working in the studio. But I guess ultimately the question is, what are the kinds of forms that are being discovered, and are they something other than just a record of working in different ways? And how do you all approach that hazy line between form and structure itself in your own work?
Okay, I'm not going to actually address that question, but I'm glad I have the mic. So, well, I'm getting to it because I don't have the answer to the question, but I have a process.
You're giving the others time to think now.
Yeah, but I have a process to propose that might create an environment in which that question could be cultivated and nurtured. And that's coming off of what Sharon said, of expanding who is on the team and who do you invite to the party, as it were. The Jet Propulsion Laboratory has an artist in residence. It's a guy named Dan Goods. His job is to show up and just be opinionated from his perspective of being an artist. He's very helpful to the scientists because he can envision things for them. And they often come to him, and we're working on this anti-gravitational something or other, and how do we show this to anyone who's coming here? The city of Los Angeles has an artist in residence for the Department of Transportation. I spoke about the ambition of collaborative work between art and architects, which is very difficult because of what the development process is, and when developers and cities are welcoming artists to join teams before things are locked down. But there seemed to be some interest in having artists as members of a community, be it within the Department of Transportation or JPL, and then they become resident to this conversation. So this idea of how do we rethink is institutionalized through you have an embedded subversive, as I would hope they would be, in the process.
Yeah, terrific.
So that's sort of to your question.
I guess I can take the
Go.
question. I have to remember what it is.
I'll make something up.
I would.
Form versus structure.
I got it.
Form.
It came to me.
Yeah.
I was thinking about a couple of structural engineers that we teach about in looking at some of the projects that are driven by form finding. So in Carpenter's project in the front room, it kind of reminded me of Shushov's infrastructural towers that carried power lines, and then this project reminds me a little bit of Otto's Mannheim, or these studies here. And there's a project by Shigeru Bon for the Hanover Pavilion that was done in paper tubes, which is kind of a play on the Mannheim. And so what happens when you move from a grid shell, and instead of fixed joints, you have flexible joints, and you have the ability for a structure to transform. So there are many kind of structural lineages in the projects that are here that are either implied or kind of tangentially touched on in the solutions, and the other is Eichler's form-found upside-down surfaces that are then hardened in ice, which I think there's a tool you invented to sort of study those structures. So to me, those are all incredible sources, and sources that I sometimes actively want to reject as a designer, as an architect, rather than an engineer, which is to say that in engineering, when efficiency is privileged, produces repetitive formal solutions. And sometimes you have to throw kind of art, sort of excess, this sort of non-efficient, non-quantifiable at the problem in order to produce spatial effects or formal effects that are not described by structural economy and efficiency. And, that can happen in paper, it can happen at the scale of an installation, it might happen at the scale of a single family home. And the larger the project gets and scales up, the more the efficiency vector takes over. So I have a great deal of respect for that efficiency vector in something like a tower. But I'm also really excited about the sort of eccentric, the non-uniform, the inefficient, and the ways in which departing from those principles gives you other kinds of experiences.
One could argue that form, perhaps in the thought like you're talking about, in the inefficient way, might come from inspiration and very humanistic in its way. But I think that when form is or any other result is driven by an idea, like what Marc is talking about, it associates itself with a technique. In technique in all sense of the word. And perhaps I should revert to an example of how, say, the Impressionists, right? They have an idea of trying to paint something that know that every minute that passes, the light is changing. They had to create a technique to be able to represent that, and the pointillism and the fuzziness of that technique. The technique alone, or the material alone, did not make the art. It was the idea behind it. And it is not unlike what we're trying to do here. It's the idea. And the idea, when integrated with sort of the humanistic value, perhaps that nature and reason, the combination of left brain and right brain, that then integrates the two. And that's when things start to resonate, I think, in architecture and endure over time.
I mean, just to follow up on that, if you could say something about the specific kinds of techniques that you feel like, or amongst your collaborators that are emerging in this kind of a thinking about working environment.
Well, obviously, one of those is this idea that Marc says about surface optimization. It could be that, but it could also be, in architecture, like Sharon was talking about, there's many dials, social issues, cultural issues, place issues, all these other things. We were just discussing in some of our projects, what makes a project LA? This is an incorporation of, we're having this lecture here on the outdoors, that inside and outside. We saw that in this house and many others that followed in the case study houses. So, but the technique is, having the ability to open the doors. The sliding door wasn't created by inspiration. It was created by a need, by an idea of connecting the inside outside. And those are the things, the pathways that as an architect one must follow to be innovative, creative, and end up to more enduring solutions, right?
I mean, Sharon, one of the things that emerges in your point about working in the way your office brilliantly sort of brings artists in from the first conversation forward is it creates a different kind of studio environment, and I've had the benefit of visiting and spending some time in your office, which doesn't resemble that thing that we used to call an architectural office very much. I mean, it's like the coolest club on the West Side. Most evenings, and it's like a late night. You know, it's like. And you're quite
we're building a building for you.
Yes. No, I know. But the point I'm getting to is that what you're really talking about is a different kind of studio space, and a space that isn't a sort of monastic,
Right.
withdrawn entity, but a kind of platform to just invite people in to become, as you say, kind of critics or part of the larger conversation around the ideas. And I'm just curious how that your experience now over the years, how that's evolved as a sort of realization for the kind of office you're making.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. That, you know, when I kind of trying to speak to that, and also your earlier question, that I think as we've, you know, developed our practice and have more experience building buildings and doing, you know, work at all scale, that I think what we're really comfortable with is we don't like starting with a sort of through line at the beginning. We like to play with our engineers. We like to talk with our clients. We think about programs. So we align elements of the project along very different trajectories. And I think for us, that's where, you know, I guess to use an overused word, but I mean, for us, that's kind of where innovation happens. That if we have a kind of formal or a planning idea, and there's a structural idea, how do you cross those? Where does that slippage happen, that something emerges that didn't come from just saying, okay, we're going to go with a plate steel system, or we're going to work with, you know, a wood truss system. It's somehow about merging an idea about space and program and structure that is where invention happens. So actually kind of keeping things apart and then finding the kind of intricate ways we can put them together is, I think, how that kind of studio culture informs how we work.
To come back to a point, Marc, that you brought up early on, this sort of collaborative experimental setting where this sort of work evolves, I think one of the questions that it raises is, how is that enabled and made possible? And at a certain level, what an exhibition like this and everybody on the panel's work as a record of is fairly brilliant clients or commissioning bodies, at times enlightened enough to realize that they can stand back from a fixed formal set of distinct requirements to a degree and see what emerges. But I guess the question for everybody here is, and I'm sure people in the audience would share this question, how do we find those people? And or help create such minds and commissioning bodies such that this kind of work can play out? And what's that environment like today? Are those the 1 in 1,000 kind of client that comes along, or is that actually something that's also evolving and changing in the world that you all work within?
I would say I would introduce that topic with the same sweep of range as from the ideal to the real. The ideal being there's a world full of ideal and wonderful, generous, open-minded clients or civic entities who want nothing more than to find the best minds and turn them loose to play and then come back in a year with a project. Now, so that's one end. The other end is on the civic end, which there's a great deal of commissioning of artists on the civic end. There's a degree of bureaucracy which is challenging to say the least and requires fortitude and stamina of a very heroic scale. So, and then on the private developer end, there again is that whole range that some developers, first of all, most developers are looking to make something happen quickly and for as little as possible. And the reason most of the projects I work on have artists is because they're required to do so. So they're not, they get excited, but then they also, you know, the default mode for a developer is anxiety and fury that things might be late or over budget. So you're having to negotiate all of these things. So, I think it's having great optimism with whoever you're working with and hoping for the best and being prepared for disaster.
Sharon's better at getting clients.
Well, I think, I mean, certainly we've had a lot of hard knocks, but I feel like one thing that is important, and you certainly see it demonstrated in every project that's on view in this exhibition, is really about educating clients. I think, one has to assume that most clients don't know that much about building buildings or what we do, and I think how do we demonstrate value through, I mean, there's financial value, but I think there's the quality of the unexpected. There's kind of the qualities of material efficiency. We see that a lot in a lot of the work on view. And I think, helping create a discourse around things beyond dollars and cents and schedules and how that brings value way long into the future, I think is a really big part of what we do. And as we've, have more ability to, hopefully get good clients, but have the confidence to educate our clients, I think we build in extra time to do that. We go look at work with people. We try to build a culture around our projects so that, people, it's like you don't want to be fighting battles all the time. You want to figure out a way to find common value and common experience. And I think, you guys at SOM are working at a scale that's global, and you have a lot of resources, and we are working at a different scale. And I think it's hard. I think you have to be even smarter than, we already have to be to do the work and get the work done that we want to do. But I think it's really amazing that you take the time to do these shows, because I think this is also, that's part of what it is. It's about education. And I think the fact that Marc and I are educators and practitioners, I think that actually goes a long way with our clients too, that there's a sort of, it doesn't happen as much in America as it does in Europe, I would say, but that we try to use that to our advantage, that there's a kind of larger discourse than just the particular project that we're working on.
I'd like to just say that it's incremental change, and I think that the proof of concept before the project is really important. So you really try to make the effort, and the effort comes from theory, it comes from practice, it comes from fearless builders. Yeah, because I think that that's without that, it's just not going to happen. So a lot of times when we push forward ideas that are, we'll call them high risk, we've got partners with us that are able to see it and build it, right? I think some of the new ideas that have been created have come from these great feats, let's say, of engineering and investment. But I'd argue that in so many ways it's a lot more important. Those scales, those projects are so special and so one-off that we need to sort of infiltrate the design community and all these other things that are much more tangible. And things like, it's not an overused kind of position. I think the environmental issues are serious for us, and so we think a lot about, how do we create performance? How do we test concepts that maybe an artist is actually thinking about? And if you look at Janet Eckelman's piece here in West Hollywood that we worked with her on, the principles of engineering tall buildings are actually in that piece. There's this concept of the Mitchell Truss, which has been talked about and used in tall buildings, and we've been thinking about the imperfections that you could actually impose from an architectural point of view on these ideas, because otherwise it's sterile, right? It's a sterile solution. So we come up with a concept, we pull on it, we push it, and it's not as efficient, but maybe it's more beautiful. We've been taking those ideas and turning them on the horizontal. So these principles of force flow and so forth are the idea of turning them flat is maybe something that people haven't thought about, and all of a sudden something jumps at us. But then you have to have somebody build it, and I think that's where a lot of times we get a bit stuck, we do. So I'll go back to incremental change, because I do think that several of the projects that we're involved with have embedded ideas that are not the big move. You have to find them. They're down inside. And
I want to stay with Janet Eckelman. So in regard to clients and how do you keep them calm and inspire them and excite them, so Janet did something she had never done before, and it was a reach. Without the calm and brilliant and inspired competence of the SOM team, she would have shrunk and kind of disappeared with anxiety, and our client would have probably fired me and her. So in this case, it was absolutely essential that SOM was present, not just because they were able to figure things out, but their long record of accomplishment was very soothing and calming to the client. So thank you guys. It made it completely possible because for Janet, what she did was something she'd never done before. And that is not easy. It was a very complicated project. So in that case, the client's trust in SOM made it possible because there were many giant bumps and ditches and trenches that we had to endure. And I know without SOM it wouldn't have happened, just from the trust point of view, from the client's perspective, because I couldn't guarantee a damn thing. Except that it would be great art.
I mean, conversely, what seems interesting is though that she also pulls SOM into a different kind of space, right? Which I guess is just a kind of exactly. So who ought to be at the table for this sort of world that you all are talking about? So far, I've heard architects, artists, engineers. Who else is a part of that conversation, or who or how is that conversation curated or moderated as a project unfolds? I'm curious. That seems like that becomes a very important kind of feature of this sort of a working space. How do you all do that, or does it just happen?
I think that how do we do that is we're all searching for impact and relevance. And we have a lot of trust in the process, and you know, it's like
And in one another,
and you just go for it, and eventually you get there. That's it.
I mean, my answer to that question is always the benefit of deadlines. Like the deadline is let's say for a species like architects who you could say obsess over space occasionally, like they take space pretty seriously, that sometimes the dimension of time falls away a bit. And it is a long, slow-moving process often. Projects, if we can do them in 5 years, we're doing pretty good work. And I have a dear friend in London who first sketched Terminal 5 out at Heathrow in 1989 and was at the opening in 2015. It's like, that's pretty good work. You know, things are moving right along. For the British, I promise you, that is pretty fast. But you know, one of the features of our world, and one of the things that engineers and architects share, is a kind of lumbering reality that, you know, we start a project and it will unfold. You know, we spend a year sort of shaping a brief. We have a couple of years of design development. Suddenly a builder's on site. If we can get them to do work in 36 months, we're feeling pretty good about things. That reality, though, sits now in a world in which this wave of urbanization and building, which Los Angeles to a certain degree is a record of, suddenly seems to create a kind of, you know, the potential for a kind of crisis, one would imagine. And I'm just curious, I guess, about the question of time in the work you're all doing, and how you see not just the project, but that project sitting in a larger arc of your own careers and ideas in the studios.
Can I answer that? Because we live this every day. Obviously, faster, cheaper, better. It's sort of the motto out there. You know, how do we do it faster? And you know, there's some constraints. Obviously, technology has helped us do that, and I don't know, sometimes it becomes an impediment because the time to think gets reduced. You know, we just can't think faster, but technology helps us. But I think there's also benefit in that when you have compressed the schedules. You know, we just finished the federal courthouse. You know, from first line on a white piece of paper to the client moved in is 40 months. Wow. It is pretty remarkable, but what it forces you to do is to collaborate more, because you cannot depend on sort of this linear process to get it done. You have to set up the ideas are the drivers, and the ideas are not only the drivers but also the tests of you going in the right direction, and you have to drive and test often and hope the process will get you there. However, I think that we're, as a profession, constantly becoming more isolated in terms of sort of what is going to the next thing in the built environment. You've seen technology companies transform other industries. You know, the biggest taxi company in the world doesn't own a car. The biggest hoteling company in the world doesn't own a hotel. And you know, we see technology companies building cars and scooters. We were just talking, you know, things like that. You know, in architecture, I think the construction industry has sort of become a laggard in a sense, but it's about to get transformed, and we need to become more. You know, I know maybe a little bit with a fear, become a little more boring and less interesting, but more modular, more component based. But I would argue that modularity is not necessarily something that is uninteresting. You know, if you look at a brick, for example, you know, it could be a pretty boring thing, but for thousands of years we've done many different shapes and forms with a brick. But you know, what is the next brick in the construction world? But that's the only way we're going to be able to answer the question of time. You use things that are pre-made, more pre-manufactured. Otherwise, you know, it's just not going to be possible. It takes too long to construct. There are companies that are evolving and growing faster than we can make buildings. And you know, how we're going to resolve that.
Any of you? Anyone else on that? Anyone want to weigh in? We're kind of coming to the end of our hour, and I don't want it to go on too long, and I thought it might be a nice moment to open it up to all of you. Questions for our distinguished panelists? Anybody?
I have a question about the integration and collaboration.
Okay. Here, let me give you a mic.
Well, I can talk.
No, here. Take it.
Essentially know this is here, they have participated or will be coming. The ones who don't know are some of the design agencies, the design committees, especially the materials manufacturers, the fabricators, and the subs. Please integrate them into the process because they're still working in the 80s and the 90s. And if you want to have a project that's integrated, everybody's on board, and you want to have a hiccup happen, it doesn't happen on this end. It doesn't happen with anybody in this room. It doesn't happen with people who know people in this room are talking about it. It's the guys that don't even know this exists. Are you guys starting to integrate them and bring them in even if they don't want to come? You make them send somebody? Because in my professional experience, we live in a world where mistakes are allowed to happen because it's a part of the growth process to become a better designer. They are not allowed mistakes. Therefore, every decision they make is constrained within a box.
Can I address that?
I can answer a little bit, and the question is yes, and they need to be more integrated. The things that sort of the rocks on the road, if you will, are more that the construction industry is still organized in silos, and there are some business practices and also legal issues about how that gets more integrated. You know, we in the design build world that we've done, you know, these large projects with very constrained schedules. You are forced to integrate. However, we still have to produce two sets of drawings, even though, you know, we collaborated with certain of these subs, and we're drawing our drawings and they're drawing their drawings, even though they have the same amount of information. And it is how do you merge those two? You need to change processes and business models to be able to accomplish that.
And I'll clarify a little bit. GCs are, I consider, part of this camp. They may not have a full body through the door. They've got a toe through the door. But the subs and the materials manufacturers and some of the code committees do not. They have no toe, no foot, no hand, nothing. Their head's not even in this direction.
I have an answer. I think that the designer has to understand how things are made and why they're made that way and with what tools and why they're detailed in particular ways to solve particular issues. Because if you understand materials and componentry, then you can, in the resolution of a design project, address the proactively address the issues that will be brought to you by a sub. So you're not just educating a client, you're really first educating yourself so that you can then educate the sub for how their manufacturing process can be adjusted or the component can be clipped differently. So if you understand it well, I think you also have to go meet them with their set of constraints and show them the solution so that you can get the result you want.
I'll keep clarifying the last one. That's exactly where I have a problem. They won't send anybody. They don't do work for free. They don't collaborate based on a maybe, an if. And when they do, if it turns out to be a mistake, the guy that helped you, you will never see him again.
Work on smaller things.
Another question? Anybody else? Okay.
One thing, I'm with Teslimi. We had the privilege of working on this project with SOM, and thank you very much. It was great fun. But I won't talk about the public bid side of things because by law, you need to have blind bids and multiple bidders, and the drawings have to be done. I'm an architect myself. I came from that world. We used to do the drawings, and we used to finish them, and the stuff got bid and it got built. But on private projects, we're asked by clients to bring multiple bidders, and as you said, those people aren't willing to necessarily come to the table, and it's not appropriate for all of them to come to the table in the early design process. We like a process where, all GCs are basically bidding from the same sub pool. And so if you hire a GC based on their, management costs and their fee and trust, then you have access to their sub pool, and you can bring those people in and talk about some of the stuff early on. And to address the comment that was just made, yeah, we do have to educate ourselves. I mean, when I was coming up in architecture in Boston, I used to go out on weekends with binoculars and try to figure out how they were hanging the precast panels and where the gravity load was and where the lateral adjustment was and things like that. Architects have to get interested again in how things are made, and there was a talk about anti-gravity. We studied anti-gravity on this project for a little while, but it turned out that it just wasn't going to work. So, gravity is a force that we reckon with, and architects need to realize that and work with it.
Until we can all find a client that wants us to redesign gravity, maybe as a project. Did I miss anybody? Anybody else got a question? Then I think we're going to draw it to a close and thank our panelists for the conversation. Thank you all for coming in. There is a bar right behind us, so we're going to make use of that for the conversation. Paul, can I hand it over to you to finish?
Thank you. So Sharon, Brett, Heather, Marc, you guys are fantastic. Thank you so much on behalf of Marc, Jose, myself for doing this. We really appreciate it. On behalf of SOM, thank you all for coming. Once again, MAK Center, thank you. Really appreciate it. I think there's one other thing we want to do before we hit the bar, and that's let our friend here do a little dance. So if there are a couple of you, Alex or others, that might be able to help us out and get this thing to float a little bit, we would appreciate it.
We should get out of the way.
So if you don't know, this was built in Chicago, built in San Francisco, built here locally, parts driven here to Los Angeles and assembled. And here we go. Don't try this at home. And if you pull it far enough, it does invert on itself, and we don't want that to happen. So thank you, guys. And thank you all again for coming. Much appreciated.